Well, thank you, everyone, and it is an honor to be here. I thought Nick did a great job of opening up, so that's going to save me some trouble. But let me start with a more basic point than we've addressed so far, which is, what do we mean by reform? Because usually what it really means is it's a change that we favor. But in fact, that's a little too vague, and we could all have very different views of what those are. I'm going to use reform here largely in the sense of movements away from state control of the Chinese economy and financial system towards more market control, more private sector influence, and similarly, an opening up internationally with flows in both directions. So I'll treat those things as signs of reform. I think it's quite clear that while the pace of reform has slowed down, it's still very much a continuation of movement toward continuing reforms, just not as fast as it was at certain points. And Nick, I thought, did a great job of running through some of the major reforms, which have continued to happen. I would, for those of you who aren't so much experts, you might wonder why deposit insurance is a reform in the sense I'm talking about it as moving towards the market. It's because there's this counterintuitive effect in China. In China, everybody knew correctly that the state was going to guarantee every bank deposit. So you had a system in which everyone acted as if there were a complete 100% guarantee of deposits, and there was no charges to the banks or the depositors for the provision of it. So actually moving to an explicit deposit insurance system where some things aren't insured, that is, above certain limits, certain types of deposits aren't insured, and you also have a deposit insurance premium charged to the banks. This is actually, even though it's establishment of a state system, it's actually a movement away from state control to a more limited role. Again, I think he did a great job of laying this out, so I'm going to largely skip what's been happening recently. I think the more interesting question in some ways is what happens next. Now, if I knew the answer to that, I would probably not be standing here talking to you. I would be off making a bucket load of money, especially since I'm back in the private sector as a consultant now. China is very hard to predict or to understand. It's a rapidly evolving economy and economic system, a less rapidly evolving political system, but there are some evolutions there as well. And it's a system where the party still has a great deal of control. The Constitution enshrines a leading role for the Communist Party. They're not at all looking to give up that role. And they also have this so-called democratic centralism that they inherited from Lenin. And part of what that means is that they have debates internally, and sometimes they'll let that leak out more broadly. But at the end of the day, the centralism part comes in, which is the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party ends up making the key decisions. And they often aren't very clear about the exact balance of forces that cause them to come out in a particular direction. So the fact that you have such strong central control that's done somewhat opaquely and such a rapidly evolving situation means that it's just difficult to know. So I'm going to give you 5 theories. I think all of them are plausible as to what happens next. At the end, I'll tell you which one I lean towards fairly heavily, but any of these could end up being the way it develops, and I'm sure other speakers might have still other theories. So let me run briefly through what the 5 are, and then I'll go through them one by one. The first one is that President Xi Jinping and colleagues on the Standing Committee will force through further reforms in order to push medium-term growth because they're worried about the economic growth rate. Second theory is no matter what they're saying, if you don't have more complete political reforms, it's going to all bog down on the economic side too. That's theory 2. Theory 3 is that On the opposite to that, incomplete reforms actually will force yet more reforms. It's like riding a bicycle. You can't really stop. You just have to keep going unless you want to fall over. A fourth theory is that a financial crisis, or at least severe stress, will cause a rollback of some of the reforms as an instinctive reaction by the central authorities. And the fifth theory I'm going to go through is that China is going to muddle through. That basically they've got economic and political pressures that make it hard for them to find any sort of optimal balance, but they'll find a way to move forward as they have in the past. And by the way, I might add, you could probably say this about almost any country in the world. Countries basically muddle through, even when they do well. There's this line, it's attributed to Winston Churchill, I don't know if it is his, but that America always does the right thing after trying everything else. And so you can see this idea of muddling through applies a lot of places. All right, so let me try to go in a little more detail on these. All right, so the first theory essentially is, and I'm going to personalize this in President Xi Jinping because he is such a strong leader and he's the face of this, but we do need to recognize he's clearly not doing this on his own. This is, to the extent that he's getting things done, there's a level of consensus within the party, and particularly the Standing Committee. Okay, so putting it that way, Xi is an economic reformer, but not a political reformer. And just to start with the latter part, I think we can pretty much agree that President Xi is not looking to make dramatic changes in the political structure of China. In many ways, he's been looking to crack down to make sure that the central role of the party stays central. On the other hand, he's been clear for years, and the party increasingly so, that economic reforms are essential in order to move China in the direction it needs to go. And so under this theory, you even take things like the anti-corruption drive, and you treat it not as either, first of all, what it is on its surface, which is corruption is a bad thing, they're trying to cut it down, or the more cynical view that if you have the power to decide who to prosecute for corruption, it significantly increases your personal power, but that whatever the merits of those two arguments are, it's also being used to basically knock down the potential opposition among vested interests to changes in the economy. And I do think there's a substantial element of that. So, as Nick has alluded to, there's been a lot of rhetoric about economic reform, as well as a number of actions, and maybe they mean it. So that's theory one. This is an economic reformer, and he has a consensus for that. Theory two is that reforms beget more reforms, that it's really difficult to sit in the middle between a relatively market-based economy and a centralized planned economy. And of course, you can find places on the spectrum that countries have chosen and have worked for a while, but that it's just difficult. When you do some opening up, there are all these pressures to others. Shadow banking is a perfect example of that. 20 years ago, you couldn't have done shadow banking. Once it became possible, it allowed a circumvention in many ways, or a release of the pressures that existed because the system was so much centrally planned and so much controlled by the state. So theory two really is a pretty straightforward one. It just says you got to keep moving forward, and they will. Theory three is that, and by the way, I think I gave the different order before, but to return to what I meant to do, that economic reforms will be blocked without political reforms. And this, in essence, says China has developed very powerful, rich, politically powerful groups that are able to block reform of state-owned enterprises. They're able to keep quotas in place for various things. They're able to lobby for cheap inputs from energy pricing and things like that. They don't see a particularly good reason to hand over all the power and wealth they've accumulated. And so without political reform, to basically bring the will of the people more to the fore, these vested interests will just block it. Now this, by the way, does ignore that there have been big changes in the past, such as, what was it, maybe 20 years ago, there was the breaking of the iron rice bowl. That you had many people who worked in state-owned enterprises who knew that they had a guaranteed lifetime employment, and what, 10 million of them, 20 million of them lost their jobs. China has been willing to do some big changes despite vested interests. Theory 4 is that financial stress will cause heavier state intervention, and we've certainly seen that with the stock market, where when the stock market started crashing down, you saw a real return to the old central control, including threatening people with jail terms and things like that. And I'll tell you in advance, Theory 5 is my personal favorite theory, that China will muddle through. We have 30 years of history, I guess maybe a little more at this point, of China's reform and opening up process, by which the party has been deliberately moving towards more market and more international orientation. They have had to go through really severe challenges over those times, more severe challenges than they're facing right now. And they've made mistakes along the way, but by and large, they've figured out how to do what they really have to do. And there's a strong recognition in the party that their legitimacy stems from the perception that they can manage the economy and the country well. And by the way, this is true of almost any government, so it seems a little funny to keep coming back to this. I mean, truthfully, if the U.S. government screwed up the economy for long enough, it would lose a lot of legitimacy too. But recognizing that growth is very, very important to their political hold, since they don't have actually much other argument at this point for being in charge, they will make the sacrifices they have to, including reducing the level of corruption so that key cadre won't actually have the kind of earnings power they had in the past, but collectively they'll still be able to stay in charge. So again, this is a theory with the greatest credibility to me, that they need the reforms, they know they need the reforms, and they've been able over 30 years to combine economic reforms with a much more modest level of political reforms, and therefore been able to stay in charge. Thank you.